Hello, and thank you for joining us today to celebrate Earth Day with this special webinar, Opportunities for Upgrading Energy Performance of Existing Buildings. Before we begin, we want to give a special thanks to all of our sustainability sponsors and Vitro Architectural Glass for their sponsorship of this webinar as a gold sustainability sponsor. And we'll share a short video.
Some of the world's most dramatic buildings showcase large panels of insulated glass. But what design considerations should you keep in mind before specifying them? And how does low-E glass actually improve building performance? The Vitro Architectural Glass Education Center is your source for videos, infographics, and articles to help you design, specify, and build with commercial glass. Discover glass design solutions at glassed.vitroglazings.com.
So thank you again to Vitro Architectural Glass for supporting NFRC to build a sustainable future and this webinar. NFRC is excited to host this special webinar, Opportunities for Upgrading Energy Performance of Existing Buildings, presented by Dr. Thomas Culp, owner of Birch Point Consulting. After earning a Ph.D. in chemical engineering from University of Wisconsin, Dr. Culp has spent the last 22 years in the glass and window industry in the areas of energy efficient glazing, window performance, low-E glass coatings, and building code development. He is also co-chair of the ASHRAE 90.1 Standards Committee and is an active participant in the International Code Council Code Development Hearing process. This webinar will highlight new initiatives to upgrade performance of existing buildings and opportunities for fenestration and glazing manufacturers. Please submit your questions in the question box and they will be answered at the end. And again, I apologize that we don't have the webcams working with the go-to today. Dr. Culp, thank you for joining us today.
First, I do a lot of work. I work closely with the National Glass Association and the Aluminum Extruders Council, and I wanted to thank them and also our sponsor Vitro. They are a good member of both NFRC and NGA, so thank you. And I'm glad to be here for NFRC's Earth Day webinar. Seeing it is Earth Day, I wanted to talk about opportunities for upgrading energy performance of existing buildings. This is a very important area and something, well, it's not necessarily new, but it will be increasing and upcoming to the forefront more than it has in the past. First, a quick note, all the pictures you'll see here, as well as throughout the presentation, these are all obviously existing older buildings that had single pane glass and have been upgraded through one pass or another. Involved with a lot of R&D and research. We work really hard on new building technology, and that's incredibly important because that's the future. But at the same time, we often overlook the vast amount of energy wasted in existing buildings, which dwarfs the energy use in new buildings. And if you look at these numbers may be a little dated, but if you look at the residential market, there's roughly 19 billion square feet of existing windows, and approximately 40% of those still have single glazing. And 3/4 of the homes were built prior to 1990 when low-E windows were not widely available. So even if it doesn't have single pane, it's a lot of double pane clears still out there. Now, of course, there is some window replacement going on, as well as new window and new homes going in. And if you look at the Ducker market data, you can look at the splits, you can roughly figure out that about 2 to 3% of all existing windows are accounted for each year in terms of either new windows, new or replacement windows. That's not much. It's similar on the commercial side. Over half the commercial buildings still have glazing, several billion square feet. And some of the CBEX data shows that over, which is less than 0.5% per year. So if you just do some crude math, it tells you that conceivably this could take well over 50 years, maybe 100 years to incorporate energy efficient windows in all buildings. And that's just simply too slow. So the question is, will this change, or is it already changing? And I will maintain, and that's what I want to talk about today, is I think it really is changing. There is something new happening. And in particular, there's been a new phenomenon in recent years where we've seen a lot of local action on climate issues and energy efficiency. Local meaning either the city or sometimes the state. I'm used to working on national building codes, model energy codes and so forth, but there's been a lot of action going on at the local level. And if you look back, this really started in 2017 at the city level as a reaction to the last administration when they exited the Paris Agreement. And if you think back and look back, within a couple of days, there were many major cities and then eventually some states that jumped in and said, fine, we're going to do this and make our own policy commitments and take our own actions to address climate change. And now that, of course, that's politics and policy level, high level. But when they started to dig into what do they actually want to commit to, they started tackling areas that would previously be considered only beyond code. Things like decarbonization, electrification of the grid, renewable energy, targets for net zero energy buildings, and what we want to talk about today, existing building emissions. Because if you don't address the existing buildings, which consume 40% of the energy use in the country, you're not going to have a complete solution. So what about at the federal level? There are two things I guess I wanted to point out. One is when the COVID relief package was passed late December, a lot of people didn't realize at first, but embedded in there was the Energy Act of 2020. So some new energy policy legislation that went through, number of things, extending tax credits for renewable energy, some funding for federal activities, and couple $1 billion to spend to extend the weatherization funding. Now that's federal funding, but then it's administered at the state level, but obviously there to help upgrade and weatherize existing homes. So that's significant. We also have a new administration, so which is actively discussing infrastructure right now. And it's a big question, what's going to pass, everything's being negotiated. But the administration is calling to retrofit 2 million homes and buildings as part of the infrastructure plan. We'll see if that happens or not. I don't know, we'll have to see. But today, I wanted to focus first on that local action because this is stuff that's happening now. We know what's occurring. And it's really happening at the local level, this new focus on existing buildings, and they're addressing it in two steps. And the first are building energy disclosure laws or ordinances. And these are usually at the city level where they require public disclosure of your building energy use. And typically it's limited to like buildings over a certain size, commonly 50,000 square feet, but of all building types, multifamily, commercial, so forth, where you have to list that in a public database. And they're doing that for a couple of reasons. One is transparency that allows policymakers to do benchmarkings, track how their city is doing. But they are also, the other main purpose is really to influence the real estate market. They want to identify both the energy stars and the energy hogs. And if you think about it, if you're considering purchasing a building or leasing space in a building, and you find out it's an energy hog, you're going to negotiate for a lower rate. Conversely, a building owner who knows they have a high performance energy star building, they're going to argue for a higher rate. So they are trying to influence the real estate market in that fashion. And then the new thing is step two is taking that the next step, which are to actually start to impose emission limits on existing buildings. And these are called building performance standards. And basically they look at that energy disclosure and then they set limits and assign financial penalties or taxes or fines, whatever you want to call it, for exceeding certain carbon or energy limits. And so we'll be talking about some of those. So first, this is a handy map from the Institute for Market Transformation. They have some good information on their website about the existing building policies, this benchmarking or transparency or disclosure laws. And every dot you see on there has some form of a energy disclosure law or ordinance or benchmarking where you have to publicly disclose that information. And as you can see, it's a lot of the major cities. That's really what's tackling at first. But there's some mid-sized cities on there as well. But it's all across the country. And this data is about 2 years old, but it's growing every year, but at least as of 2 years ago, about 11 billion square feet of floor space across the country and then across all building types was covered by these disclosure benchmarking policies. And then, like I said, the next step is then to take those and then start to impose actual emission limits for existing buildings. So first question is where? So this is newer, so it's not all across the country yet. And the places that have enacted building performance standards include New York City, Washington State, District of Columbia, and St. Louis. And we're also expecting a few others to follow along. Boston will be my guess at the next one, but you never know. There'll be a lot of cities I think will follow suit, maybe Seattle. What about when? When do these take place? So in these locations, they've already been enacted, so they're in place, but that means starting to get ready, either setting limits or starting the measurement period for measuring energy performance of these buildings. The fines won't hit until about 2025, 2026. But that means the building owners have already started planning. You have to take into account the construction cycle if you're going to do a big retrofit, a big project, as well as financing. So let's talk about some of those, and then I'll talk about what does that mean for our industry. So first, you've probably heard of New York City Local Law 97. That's the one that's made probably the most news. And this is a carbon emission limit for existing buildings over 25,000 square feet. This is 2025 if they exceed those certain limits. And they're first targeting the 20 worst buildings in 2024, but then they're going to aim at going to hit 75%, so the majority of the buildings in 2030. There are options to purchase renewable energy credits within the city to offset that. And so if you want to be lazy and not do anything, you can do this, where you purchase PV or BIPV credits, and a number of our members work in that area. Governor Cuomo at the state level has also proposed to allow purchase of RECs outside of the city, but this is being opposed by a lot of the activists in the city because they view that as a get out of jail free card. They want the improvement in the city, so that at least currently you have to purchase renewable energy credits within the city or upgrade your building. We'll see where that ends up though. So this is just an example table. This shows what the emission limits are, and it's based on occupancy type. So a multifamily residential building will be different than an office building or a hospital. But you calculate your energy use, and then they have a certain way that you convert that into your equivalent carbon dioxide emissions, and then you pay a penalty for your excess emissions, $268 per year per metric ton of carbon equivalent. There are also penalties for missed reports, 50 cents a square foot of floor area per month. That's actually quite significant, it adds up very rapidly, as well as significant fines for false reports. So these are big numbers. They're taking this very seriously. And so I have a colleague from ASHRAE that I work with who does energy consulting in New York City, and he's helping building owners to look at these upcoming emission limits and see how they will fall out. So he looked at 17 different office buildings. Actually, one of those is a data center, which has very high energy use, and so it's kind of an outlier. So I'm just going to talk about the other 16. And in fact, the city's trying to figure out how they're going to handle data centers, because they're kind of an unusual animal. But for the 16 office buildings between 40,000 and 500,000 square feet, he shared his data with me. And initially, for the 2024 limits, only 2 out of the 16 fail. And that is kind of what New York City's trying to do, just get at the worst 20% or so of the buildings. But by 2030, 14 out of the 16 fail. So almost all of them. So that's very significant. And the penalties are significant. They range from, in terms of real dollars for these real buildings, 50,000 up to 700,000 for the 2024. Or if you put it in terms of floor area, square footage of floor area, that's 30 cents to $3 a square foot of floor area. Very significant. And then even more so at the 2030 levels, which then also apply to more buildings. So what's that do? Creates a large incentive for upgrading existing buildings. We're used to building owners looking at these existing buildings, just talking about doing projects on lighting or mechanical systems, because they're either easier or cheaper, have a shorter payback typically than an envelope retrofit. Well, some of that's going to be changing. The fines and this type of money will improve the economics of looking at the envelope as well to get under these limits. So that'll bring up issues and opportunities such as glazing and window replacement, as well as these new secondary glazing systems. And I'll talk a little bit about those. It's also interesting, these building owners, when talking with them, some of them, not all of them, but some of them are taking these numbers, whether it's like, you know, $200,000 fine, multiplying it by 5, so in that case, $1 million, to get a budget. And they're saying, all right, I'm going to use that budget of $1 million to improve my building. And if it gets me below the emission limit, I can view that as an automatic 5-year payback, which is very good. And so they would much rather spend that $1 million on improving their building with a 5-year payback and continuing to be an improved building for well beyond that, rather than paying the mayor a fine every year forever. So it's kind of an interesting way of looking at the economics and something you should factor in when you're talking to building owners about doing upgrades. Also, kind of another observation that's a little strange, but if you think about it, new buildings instantly become existing buildings. And that sounds strange, but as soon as you walk away from that building, it is an existing building that will have to be subject to these same existing building limits. Now, of course, a new building is going to have new technology and it's going to perform better, but we hope that this will also help building owners to have a longer term viewpoint thinking when they're, and reduce short-term value engineering when they're looking at their designs that they want to fund. Where else? St. Louis. St. Louis has energy use limits instead of carbon emission limits. They're targeting the worst 35% of the buildings. They're targeting all types of buildings, so private, commercial, multifamily buildings, public buildings over 50,000 square feet. And so that'll hit, your measure, it's already in place and active, but their fines won't hit till mid 2025. District of Columbia, they are doing energy use limits targeting the median. So in other words, 50% of the buildings based on the Energy Star EUI, Energy Use Index ratings of those buildings, but they may move to a carbon emission metric in the future. Starting off with private buildings over 50,000 square feet and public buildings over 10,000 square feet. In this case, public buildings meaning owned by the District of Columbia. Federal buildings in the district, they're under, they're federally operated, so they're under different provisions in some of the energy policy acts. But these fines will start to hit in 2026. And then you have Washington State. So this is one going at the state level where they passed HB 1257, which are energy use limits, which are fines for exceeding limits, but they also include incentive credits for performing beyond the limits. So it's both the stick and the carrot approach in this case. And they're initially targeting buildings 15% below average, or similar to St. Louis, targeting the 35% worst buildings in the state. And starting with the big buildings, over 220,000 square feet in 2026, and then over a couple of years, scaling that down to 50,000 square feet. And then I mentioned Seattle. They're not doing a building performance standard like the other cities and states, at least not yet. They might soon, but what they're doing right now is they have a new energy code, which strongly pushes people to electrification. And then they also have a program that they're trialing. So I don't know the funding on it or how long it'll last, but there is a program where they're treating energy efficiency improvements like PV generation, where you get paid a certain number of cents per kilowatt hour, in this case, savings versus generation. So it's kind of an interesting new approach, a new way to do an incentive program for upgrading existing buildings. So what's this mean? That's what these cities and states are doing, taking big progressive steps. What's that mean for us? Like I mentioned, a lot of times building owners are looking at lighting, mechanical systems, but now there's a new large incentive to upgrade existing buildings, including the envelope and including the windows. And there's a big opportunity there across all building types, commercial buildings, both public and private, multifamily buildings. Low-rise residential generally is not covered by these building performance standards, but they are covered by weatherization as well as utility incentive programs. And of course, since these are existing buildings, a number of them, especially on the East Coast, are historic buildings, which brings in a whole different aspect. You have to work with historic preservation boards and get approvals that match the appearance of the windows. In some cases, they won't even let you replace the window. You have to look at other measures. But there are a number of solutions out there for our industry. You can look at everything from glazing replacement to sash replacement to full window replacement. There's also kind of these new products out there, secondary glazing, where you add additional glazing layer to the existing window. So kind of improve or upgrade the existing window. On the commercial side, these are known as commercial secondary windows, although there's different terms out there, I guess. On the residential side, these are called often low E-storm windows or panels, and they're well suited for when the existing window is in good shape and replacement is either impractical or cost prohibitive, or where historic restrictions do not allow you to replace the window. So that's a good option there. And of course, there's a number of programs out there to help support all these. NFRC, of course, here today, offers rating and certification of a sash and full window replacement. On the other side, there's a sister organization, AERC, that rates attachment products around windows. And so that includes, they have a new rating system for these commercial secondary windows and low E-storm windows. And then, of course, we have our friends at EPA and Energy Star, where they support both aspects with the Energy Star program for windows, doors, and skylights. And then they also have a Energy Star program for low E-storm windows, particularly aimed especially at lower income or historic type applications. So I know, this being NFRC, a lot of us are already familiar with replacement window benefits and case studies. So I won't really go into that too much, but I did want to just highlight this low E secondary glazing because it's new to a lot of people. So there's a number of case studies out there, but I just picked two. These are both in the Philadelphia area. They were part of a DOE funded project that I was involved with, along with NHB Research Center, J.E. Berkowitz, Quanta Panel, Larson, and then some of the glass companies. So on the left is an office building, on the right's an apartment building. First on the left, this is a 12-story office building right downtown Philadelphia, single pane glass. And in that case, they used the Berkowitz system, renovated by Berkowitz, but there are other products, similar products from other companies out there, where you had the existing single pane, and then they added an IG unit and a narrow profile frame with a hermetic seal to basically turn that single pane glazing into triple pane low E. And we put in some special equipment to measure side-by-side energy savings in some office buildings, a couple pairs of office buildings on different sides of the building, as well as the overall energy use of the building. And we saw dramatic improvements, as you might expect, going from single pane to triple pane. You see 40 to 60% reduced energy use in the perimeter zones, and then 25% reduction in the overall building energy use, even though there's a lot of interior zones of the building. On top of the energy savings, it was interesting. The building manager, he was ecstatic because he ran 3 boilers in the basement. You have to go in at like 4 a.m. and start warming up the building, so it would come to temperature by the time the tenants would start to come to use the building. After the retrofit, he's able to turn off one of those boilers completely. So that already shows roughly a third energy savings. And he was able to start his warm up later, and it went a lot faster, making both the building manager and the tenants a lot happier. So it was quite a success story. On the right side, that's an apartment. We actually did a couple apartment buildings, 3-story large apartment buildings, number of units, single pane windows, very old, that had existing but old clear glass storm windows on there. We replaced the old storm windows with modern, new, low E storm windows, and saw a 20% reduction in overall heating use, 9% reduction in overall cooling use, and 10% reduction in infiltration, air leakage. Think of these things as both improvements in insulation and air leakage. You are addressing both aspects in the building. We've done a number of blower door tests in these buildings, and we would measure, these old buildings are very leaky through various aspects of the building, including the windows. And we would measure 2, 3, 4, 5 CFM per square foot leakage through the windows, which is huge. So if you go in with a window replacement at 0.3, or a fixed window at 0.1, or some of these attachment products, secondary glazing products that also do air sealing, you can get dramatic reduction in air infiltration, which leads to good energy savings and improved comfort and other benefits. So those were from the other DOE research we did. I'm just have a bunch of pictures here from some of the other projects that have been out there, both replacement and secondary glazing. Of course, in the middle there, you got the Empire State Building that Traco and then later Sirius was involved with. Dramatic energy savings. The upper right is the New York Times building where LB&L did a nice research study, including both the energy savings and daylighting of that building. You can see you have a wide range. Lower left is a low-income Chicago-style bungalow, low-income housing. But on the lower right, you have more upscale housing. Both of these were addressed through low-ease storm windows. You have historic buildings. That upper left is a library in Pennsylvania that had special requirements for matching the historic appearance in upgrading the single pane glazing. There's some more pictures. Building in the upper left, there's a bazillion of these office buildings across the country. Single pane glass, drastic need of upgrading and big potential for energy savings. The upper right, that's a building in the Bronx that's single pane windows. And this is a perfect example of what New York City is going to be doing, going in and upgrading buildings like this from single pane to whatever, but it's a huge opportunity. Again, we see kind of different housing examples there, from kind of older, lower income housing to in the upper center to more historic upper end housing in the lower right, both upgrade projects. And then the one in the lower left, that was a high-rise building in Connecticut where had single pane glass, kind of precast concrete, and it was embedded in the aggregate, which made it very impractical to do a glazing replacement and cost prohibitive. So they came up with a solution of adding low-E glazing system to the inside of it. So you can do it from the interior. You don't have to hire cranes or other systems, and it dramatically reduced the cost, yet upgraded the energy performance. So those are a bunch of examples. And oh yeah, there's one more picture there. I love this. This is Halligan Hall. It's part of the U.S. Navy Academy in Annapolis, well over 100 years old. And they had very special requirements because you can see some kind of unique shapes in the windows and grids, as well as the naval seafoam green color that they had to match and get approval on. And so that was another interesting way of upgrading the existing windows in a historic application. So just in summary, there will be a continued focus on high performance window systems for new window technology. Very important, that will continue, but also look for increased opportunities in existing buildings. And this is happening in some of these cities and states, and it's going to continue where fines maybe not starting until 2025 onwards, but they need solutions now. The planning has already started. So really look into these markets and see what opportunities there are. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation. We do have one question here. So do you know if there are guidelines or recommendations that building management is receiving to meet these new limits?
I know New York City has a bunch of materials out there to kind of ease people into it, and I would expect the other cities are doing the same, like DC and St. Louis. I don't know for sure, but I've seen some of the materials from New York City, and yes, they talk about what can be done. They're a little frustrating because they do point at the easy things like lighting and upgrade your boiler and adjust your set points, and that's good. They should be doing that, but they should be doing that and looking at their envelope and window systems. So they're out there, but for an industry, I would say yes, they will do the easy things, that might be enough to get them through 2024, but for 2030, they're going to need to take bigger steps, including the envelope and the fenestration. So there are tools out there. You just have to do a Google search and plug in some of the keywords like local law 97 for New York City or HB 1257 for Washington State, and they'll pop up.
Great. Is Berkowitz still producing the interior sash?
That's a good question because, of course, that's been in the trade press how J.E. Berkowitz's assets are kind of being purchased by another company. This though was part of Renovate by Berkowitz, which was spun off as a different company even prior to all that. I honestly don't know. I'd have to check. As far as I know, it's still a product out there. Similar systems are also out there from Wausau and other companies. I don't mean to highlight one or the other, but there's a number of, I think Alpin has a insert type system like that. There's a number of systems out there that can be used for that. So NEA, Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, has a program specifically pushing commercial secondary glazing in that Pacific Northwest market. So just some of the words you could look for would be commercial secondary glazing, commercial secondary windows, and those types. And hopefully you can find some information on these products.
Great. Would you mind showing the summary of the states and cities again?
Oh, yeah. Just the list?
I think this was just one of the questions, and maybe there's a follow-up.
But what was the question?
Let's see if there's a follow-up coming. Maybe they just wanted to see it again real quickly.
Oh, I see.
And we'll also be posting the presentation as well.
Yep, okay, they just wanted to see the list.
Okay.
So another question is, when the cities and municipalities are asking building owners to report their energy consumption, what are they measuring?
So each one is a little different, but it all comes down to energy use. So even in New York City, they basically, you take your heating energy, the total building, heating fuels, electricity, which will be your cooling, but also lighting, and it's everything, computers, everything. It's not just heating and cooling, it's total building energy use. And then they have some formulas that will convert that into the metric they want. So New York City uses equivalent emissions of carbon. So based on your electricity use for the annual electricity use, you multiply it by a factor to get your carbon use for that. And then same thing for the heating fuels based on whether you're using gas or oil or something else. And then that'll add up into your carbon emissions. So that's what New York City's doing. The other places are using energy. And so that's District of Columbia is using the Energy Star Buildings metric, not, we're used to Energy Star Windows, but there's a Energy Star Buildings program where they have a score based on the energy use index. And some of these have site energy, some have source energy, but basically it's adding up your energy use of all your fuels, heating fuels and electricity. But you'd have to, each city will have a little different guidance on how to do that.
Great.
It's a simple calculation though that you can do from your utility bills.
There was a comment that Thermalite produced an interior sash for energy and blast requirements in
right, great.
Indiana.
Yep, another good example.
Yep, acquired by AIT Glass.
Yeah.
And do they provide any performance metrics for windows or other fenestration products when they're doing these assessments?
Not really. That's evolving because well, the building code still applies when you do a replacement. Then you have to meet the current energy code. So that would then tie you back to a certain U factor and SHGC. When you're doing a replacement, that's going to be an NFRC number. When you're doing this commercial secondary glazing, the energy code does not really govern that because you're not removing what's there and you're improving what's already there. So it's kind of exempted. ASHRAE does say it needs to have a low E layer in there, but it doesn't specify a certain U factor or SHGC. That may evolve over time. The AERC rating system does have U factor and SHGC numbers in there over a assumed default existing window. That's the challenge with anything with existing windows attachments is you have to assume something about what's there already. And so architects may be picking up on that or utility programs and specify something. But right now, no, it's going to be more, if you're doing a replacement, it'll be meeting the energy code numbers. If you're doing an addition, one of these attachments, it's going to be more of a discussion with the building owner or the architect on, what performance levels needed, what are the savings, how do you estimate the savings, which is always tricky. So you may have to hire an energy consultant, not me, I don't do that kind of stuff, but other types of consultant to do estimate the energy savings on a building. So it's still kind of an evolving world, I would say, in that standpoint.
Great. It looks like Dennis Anderson has his hand raised. Let me see if I will unmute him.
Hey, Tom. Thanks for the presentation.
Yep, of course.
My question is kind of like a comment because one of your first slides kind of startled me a little about the use of single glazed windows still predominantly out there, and and you're heavily involved with co-development, and I'm wondering why do they keep making the codes better, but yet windows are not getting any better? So it seems like one's not matching the other. As you think the code would match? Okay, we got single glazed windows. Let's try to at least get the double glaze and get people to meet the code at that level. But it seems like the code just keeps going better and better, yet windows are not.
Yeah, well, right. Well, and that's part of the problem is it takes time. So on the residential side, in the US, there's roughly 110 million homes or something like that. What's the housing starts each year? If you look at it, there might be a couple million. It goes up and down depending on whether we're in a recession or not. So that's part of where this new homes, if you're only addressing 1% of the existing building market each year, it's going to take you forever. And then even if the window replacement, it's still too slow, and that's why it changes slowly. There's just a lot out there, and that's the challenge, is how do you accelerate that? These numbers come from DOE's Energy Information Administration, their REX data and CBEX data, and so it's is it accurate? I don't know. It's because that struck me as very high too. I've seen it multiple times, so I think it's somewhat real. And from the case studies that I've been involved with, yeah, there's a lot of single glazing still out there.
Oh, all right, thanks, Tom.
Yeah.
So it looks like we have one more question. What are some easy, cost-effective ways to upgrade, and do you think there will be incentive programs for upgrading?
Yeah, so like I say, it can be the whole range. It can be full window replacement, especially if the existing window is in bad condition. If you can't do that either because of cost or just sometimes or historic covenants or things like that, you can look at glazing only replacement or sash kits, or I guess in between there if it's that type of a window, or these commercial secondary glazing, where you add the existing glazing. So that's the low E glazing that you can add on either as a single pane or a double pane. And yes, there are incentive programs. There's a number of utility incentive programs out there, both for Energy Star windows, but also for low E storm windows. Rhode Island, Wisconsin used to have one. I don't know if it's still in effect. I'm blanking it, but there have been a number of utility. Vermont had a program out there, so there's a lot of utility incentives that have been out there. You can probably I know there's probably two different sources. One would be Efficient Windows Collaborative, which is now administered by NFRC. Usually has some good data on there about utility incentives and programs that are out there. And then AERC, I don't know if it's on their website or if you talk to staff there, they also are monitoring some of the utility programs on the attachment side of things. So look for those opportunities.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other questions, but if folks still have questions, I'm sure they can give you an email. We'll make sure that they have your email address.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today and presenting for our Earth Day webinar. We also want to thank Vitro Architectural Glass for sponsoring. And if anybody wants to learn how they can get more involved with NFRC sustainability efforts, feel free to give me an email. So thank you all for joining us today.